Who is the bride in Revelation 19, starting in verse 7? It says this, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." So I come from a dispensational background, and I'm pretty comfortable in that. Honestly, I consider myself a dispensationalist. But the dispensational view on this verse is that the bride is the church, the New Testament church, starting at Pentecost, and that excludes Old Testament Israel, God's covenant people. Usually the dispensational view holds that Israel will have a different role, both in the kingdom, but actually at this ceremony too, that they might be guests, as some of Jesus' parables might suggest in, like, say, Matthew. So as I've been reading through Revelation and working on a book about it, what I've been trying to do is just ask myself, what is the plain reading of this? If I could just step outside of theological frameworks, what does it seem like it's saying? And what I've landed on mostly is a fairly dispensational view of it. I mean, futurist and, it's still to come and, stuff like that. But on this one, I realized I felt a little bit comfortable saying that Israel's saints, the Old Testament believers in the coming Christ, are somehow excluded from being the bride. And so that kind of sent me down this rabbit hole of just thinking, well, what could it mean? I had a friend that told me recently that the word, so by the way, the word in the New Testament that we translate as church, it's ecclesia, and it can mean something like congregation or gathering or maybe even collection or something like that. I'm not good in Greek, but that's basically what it can mean. And in the Old Testament, the Hebrew equivalent of that is often used in conjunction with Israel, like the congregation of Israel would be the ecclesia of Israel. If it happened to be in Greek, it's in Hebrew. But the point is, could that mean that there is this continuity that runs through all of the Bible of God's people? And while it would be accurate to call it the church, we have a certain idea of what church means now today, and so maybe we would zoom out from that just for the purposes of accuracy. That there's this continuity of God's people running through the entire Bible from Adam on. And, sometimes the argument is, well, something changed big time at Pentecost. And I totally agree. Something totally changed. But I think, what if it changed in its operation, but not in its personnel? The God's people are now under new management, direct management of the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit now indwells the individuals rather than kind of working, as Jesus said, with them. Now that he's going to be in them, as he said to his disciples. And so something definitely changed at Pentecost. But what if it still had a continuity, that the church has always been there? It just hasn't always been called that because Greek is the New Testament language. And but let's say in C.S. Lewis's Old Solar language, what would it have been called? Would it have two different names based on what happened before and after Pentecost? Or would it have a continuity? And I'm leaning towards thinking that maybe there's this continuity of God's people all through the Bible, and that might be why Paul could say that Gentiles are now being grafted in. And the way that he says it makes it feel like they're grafted into something that has existed, that its origin was Israel. And that Gentiles are grafted into that, rather than thinking of it as this new thing, this completely new thing started at Pentecost. It's an old thing that was renovated, and they're being grafted into that. Possibility. I wouldn't die on that hill, but it's kind of where what I'm leaning toward. It also makes me think of Paul's discussion about spiritual Israel, that people that are Abraham's children are those who have believed. And that makes me lean towards this idea that there's this continuity, But I'm struggling because coming from a dispensational background, from the time I was a child, I was taught about these dispensations that God's covenant people ended. Well, actually, didn't necessarily end, but He's still got His covenant with His people, but that's separate from the church, and the church age believers are gonna. They're gonna have. It's gonna be very different for them. Here's some places where I still do feel very dispensational. It's in the kingdom. I think Israel probably will have a different role in the kingdom. We see that even in New Testament passages. So that feels very dispensational to me. So anyway, I'm throwing a lot in there and I'm shaking it up, trying to figure it out. But I haven't landed on any particular thing. I have a couple of questions for you guys, and it's why I'm giving this. So I'll get to that in a second. But I have one more idea that I want to throw at you. I know it's a lot, but one more idea is that, okay, so I'm a free grace. First and foremost, I'm a believer in Jesus, but my understanding of that belief that I have in Jesus is through a free grace lens, which means that I think hypothetically a person could believe in Jesus, receive the free gift of salvation, and they do very little to nothing with it. Like, I think someone could arrive in heaven having done virtually no good works. Hard to imagine because the Holy Spirit's in them and working on them, but hypothetically, let's just go with the hypothetical. Let's say that someone did next to nothing. It gives us a challenge with this verse 8 in Revelation 19. It says, "And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen," that her is the bride. So I think that's believers from all time. I'm leaning that way. "And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." So what I've done as a free grace person for a long time, and I'm rethinking it, is to say that at this point, there would be believers who are excluded from the marriage supper of the Lamb because they don't have any righteous acts. They've received salvation. They'll be in heaven, but they won't be at the ceremony. And if I'm being completely honest, there's some good arguments for that. Okay, so I'm not throwing those out. There's good arguments for that. I definitely think unfaithful, lazy believers, lazy servants, will have less privileges and less reward in the kingdom of heaven. I definitely think that. But will they be involved at this ceremony? I think it's possible they will, and here's why. What I'm thinking is, how many dresses does a bride wear on her wedding day? Does she wear a bunch of individual dresses for all of her parts? Or does she wear one dress that covers all of her parts? She wears one dress that covers all of her parts. Now, it tells us that the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. And so my thought here, we're in metaphor land, but my thought here is that every believer has the opportunity to contribute fabric for the wedding dress for this day. Some believers will contribute a lot of fabric. Some believers will contribute a very small amount of fabric, but it all goes into one dress. And that one dress covers the entire bride, which I think is believers from all time. And so what this would mean is that if an individual believer contributed virtually no fabric or none at all, they would still wear the dress, though, because the linen is a single cumulative garment. It's a singular garment. It's a unified garment. And my thought on this is that the God's people have a work that they are given to do. I'm going to call it the church because I'm just used to calling it the church, but I'm starting to think of the church as maybe extending backward into the Old Testament, but it operated different then. But so when I say church, just understand that's traditionally how I talk. So the church has been given work to do in the world, and that work has been done by this point in Revelation. And so this garment that's being worn is, I think, possibly this unified garment. And it's not individual garments that individuals wear that are based on their individual assessment at the judgment seat. I think this is a unified garment of all of the work that the church, God's people, have done. Therefore, all of God's people would wear it. Now, there's a challenge for that in Revelation, because, I mean, Revelation talks about white garments being a reward, and I'm still wrestling with how to think about that. I'm just admitting I don't, the parts aren't quite lining up, but it's just a thought. One more thought is that sometimes you hear Bible teachers take Jesus's parables, especially the ones that have a wedding or a ceremony in it, and they'll say that that connects to this, being the bride and the ceremony. But the challenge is, like the Jesus's parable about the wedding ceremony, or the 10 virgins, which had a wedding theme to it, is the people he's talking to and hearing the parable, they're not the bride, they're the guests, or they're the wedding performers. So it's a different image, I think. I think it's not necessarily the same thing. So, boy, that's a lot. One final thought, just so that you understand how I'm thinking about theology. I don't know if everybody does it this way. I feel like I've met people who think of theological issues as a light switch. You either are this position or you're that position, and you can't be both, etc. That's a challenge to me, because when you read one particular author, it's very easy to be convinced of their logic, and then when you read another, it's easy to be convinced of their logic. And especially on non-essential issues like this one, that we shouldn't divide over, by the way, where it's okay for believers to theorize about what these things mean. On these kind of issues, the way that I think of it is in terms of a confidence scale. So let's say theological position number 1, I have like a 80% confidence scale. I think that one's fairly likely to be right. But number 2 for me might be like a 70%, And I know that seems odd, but it's like, hey, I have a pretty high confidence in this position, but I have a somewhat high confidence in this position too. And so I'm not saying that this other one has no merit. I'm just saying, like, if it were a confidence race on which one of these positions is out ahead, this one's a little bit out ahead. And so that's when I say I'm leaning towards this other idea. That's what I mean. I don't mean I've thrown out this, this traditional view of this, but when I'm weighing them, this idea has a little bit more weight in my mind. So here's what I want to know from you. I want to know your perspective on this issue just theologically, but I also want to know, how serious of an issue is this to you, or people that you know, or Bible teachers that you know? Is this the type of thing that you've seen people divide over, or is this an issue that's kind of a side issue? For me, this is kind of a side issue. Who the bride is, it's not a main issue. But I feel like I've heard people get pretty riled up about trying to maintain that they know exactly who this bride is and all of that kind of thing. So I want to know, how emotionally attached are we to this idea, or is there some room for flexibility here? I don't particularly like being shot at with Bible bullets. So I want to know, if I were to publish on this particular idea with, this kind of being my leading idea, or my idea with the most weight, would I be steamrolled for that? And by the way, when I'm publishing on these sorts of things, a lot of what I'm generally doing is I'm saying, some Bible teachers think this, some Bible teachers think this, and those might be right. But here's where I am on it. That's kind of the way I'm doing it. And I want to be generous in that way. I want to acknowledge that there are brilliant minds behind all of the theological positions. I really believe that. They're brilliant, brilliant people on all sides of pretty much any issue. It's not about intellect. It's not about intelligence. A lot of it, I think, is about experience and being emotionally attached to certain ideas. And so I want to give room for that, so that we can have better conversations and less upset debates. I do not like that kind of stuff. So I want us to do better. I just want us to do better. So that's my take on it. I would love to hear from you. I would love to know what you think. Feel free to respond in the comment section of whichever platform you're watching this video on. Thanks a bunch.